It was 1945, the final, trembling year of a world at war, when fear ruled every border and mercy seemed like a relic of a forgotten age. The Pacific skies were thick with humidity and the lingering echo of distant gunfire. Tropical winds pressed against the battered trees of a remote military outpost, where a small unit of exhausted Allied soldiers received an unexpected order. One that would test not just their discipline, but the very core of their humanity. Before them, escorted under the grim grey dawn, stood a group of Japanese women prisoners of war. Worn down by hunger, sleepless nights, and the heavy realization that their nation's final chapter was already being written in ash and surrender. Their uniforms, torn by jungle marches, clung to them like fading shadows of the empire they once served. Their faces, some barely more than girls, held no defiance now, only dread. Word had spread among the prisoners. They knew what the regulations said. They knew what usually happened when women prisoners were captured in the Pacific theater. And when the commanding officer stepped forward with a sealed envelope in hand, the air fell impossibly still. Inside that envelope was the order, one that should have sealed their fate. But war does strange things to the soul. And sometimes, in the unlikeliest moments, the world witnesses a spark of humanity that refuses to be extinguished. These women, trembling and prepared for death, were about to encounter not the cold brutality they expected, but an act of compassion that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The jungle was still heavy with moisture when the soldiers assembled in the clearing, an uneasy patch of earth carved between towering trees and thick undergrowth that seemed to hold its breath along with them. The sun had not yet fully risen, but faint streaks of pale gold filtered through the canopy, painting the fog with an otherworldly glow. Dew clung to uniforms and rifle barrels like tiny beads of glass. Every movement, every shift of a boot, sent muted ripples through the damp ground, the soil darkened by last night's rain. The men were tired. Tired in a way that went beyond muscle and bone, tired in the soul. Tired of the echoes of gunfire that had become the soundtrack of their existence. They stood in formation because duty required it. Discipline had been drilled into them long before the war's cruelty stripped them of innocence. Yet, even as their boots pressed evenly into the soaked earth, there was something uneven about the atmosphere, something unsettled. The jungle seemed too quiet. The hum of insects felt distant, almost muffled, as if nature itself knew something irreversible was about to happen. On the far end of the clearing, escorted by a pair of guards, stood the Japanese women. Their presence felt like a wound in time, a reminder that the war's brutality did not spare anyone, not the combatants, not the civilians dragged into its orbit, and certainly not women who had been swept up by forces far larger than themselves. They were silent, heads lowered, each pair of hands bound loosely in front of them. Their uniforms, if they could still be called uniforms, were now little more than torn, faded cloth barely holding together. The fabric, once crisp with military order, now looked like it had surrendered long before they did. One of the women, perhaps in her early 20s, had dried mud smeared across her cheek. Another clutched the sleeve of the woman beside her, more for stability than comfort. Most of them stared downward at the ground, but a few lifted hesitant glances toward the soldiers. Their eyes were hollow, carrying the heavy understanding of what was expected to come. They had heard the rumors. What happened in certain parts of the Pacific once female prisoners were taken. They knew that surrender did not always end suffering. Some of them had whispered throughout the night. Others had remained completely silent, too afraid to hope, too afraid to despair. The Allied soldiers tried not to stare, but it was impossible not to feel the weight of the sight. These were not warriors now. These were not enemies in the way the strict definitions of war insisted they were. These were human beings reduced to trembling silhouettes, and somewhere in the hearts of the soldiers watching, something conflicted stirred, an awareness that the war had pushed them into a role they did not recognize within themselves. Then came the officer. He stepped into the clearing with a presence that silenced whatever remnants of sound still lingered. His boots landed with authority, splashing slightly in the softened soil. In his hand was a sealed envelope, folded, official, unmistakable. The men recognized it immediately. Orders. They always came like this: crisp paper, deliberate handwriting, the weight of someone else's will delivered into their hands with no choice but compliance. The officer's expression was carved from stone, not because he lacked emotion, but because emotion had long ago been locked away behind mental barriers necessary for survival. He approached the center of the clearing, the women directly before him, the soldiers forming an unbroken semicircle behind him. The air thickened as he broke the seal. Even the women lifted their eyes now, slowly, hesitantly, like those awaiting the reading of a final verdict. He unfolded the paper with the same care one might handle a fragile relic, though the words inscribed were anything but delicate. As his eyes scanned the contents, a shift occurred within the ranks. Shoulders stiffened, breaths shallowed. A ripple of dread seemed to pass invisibly from soldier to soldier like a cold breeze. They all knew. And perhaps the women knew too. A few closed their eyes in resignation. One squeezed the hand of the woman beside her, her lips trembling as she whispered something that didn't carry far enough for anyone to hear. Some prayers leave no sound. The officer cleared his throat. What happened next would etch itself into the memories of everyone present, carving itself permanently into the deepest folds of their conscience. He began to read. The words were official, emotionless, detached, yet brutal in their simplicity. They carried the authority of command, but also the merciless logic of war. He read them aloud, his voice steady, though something behind it wavered. The contents were unmistakable, an instruction for execution. The Japanese women did not scream. They did not run. They simply bowed their heads even lower. Acceptance spread over their faces like a quiet fog, settling into the fine lines of exhaustion. Some bit their lips to keep from trembling. Others let silent tears fall, the droplets blending into the remaining moisture on their cheeks. In the Pacific theater, they had long been instructed to expect death before mercy. Now, facing the soldiers, they braced themselves for a fate they believed inevitable. The Allied soldiers, however, were not ready. When the officer finished reading, he paused. It was the kind of pause that contained an entire argument within it. Conflict, hesitation, resistance, and the unbearable weight of choice. The soldiers looked at him. He looked at them. And between them all hung an unspoken question. How far does duty go before it breaks what remains of our humanity? One soldier's grip tightened on his rifle, not from readiness, but from unease. Another shifted his feet, unable to stay still under the crushing morality of the moment. A third swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the humidity. Not one of them raised their weapon. Not one of them moved an inch toward carrying out the command. Their training told them what they were supposed to do. Their hearts refused. A fragile, aching silence settled across the clearing. It was a silence heavy with fear. Fear in the women's hearts. Fear in the soldiers' consciences. Fear in the officer's soul. The jungle itself seemed to lean closer, listening, witnessing. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like hours. The officer lowered the paper, his hand trembling ever so slightly. His jaw tightened. His eyes scanned the faces of the women in front of him. Faces that were tired, starved, terrified, but undeniably human. And then his gaze moved to his men. They stood as still as statues, yet every pair of eyes told the same story: we cannot do this. They were not refusing his command. They were refusing the war's cruelty, refusing to become executioners of unarmed women who could barely stand. In that suspended moment, the officer felt something break inside him, not a fracture of weakness, but a fracture of clarity. The war had demanded many things from him. He had obeyed countless orders, but this was something else. This was a line he could not cross. The officer inhaled deeply, his chest rising with decision. He looked once more at the paper in his hand. It fluttered slightly as a breeze moved through the clearing, as though nature itself urged him to let it go. And in that moment, long before he would deliberately tear it apart, something monumental happened. The order lost its power, not because the ink faded, not because the war ended, but because a group of exhausted, battle-scarred soldiers silently, collectively refused to surrender their humanity. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their refusal lived in their stillness, in their lowered rifles, in the solemn sorrow etched across their faces. The Japanese women sensed this shift, faintly, tentatively. A few lifted their heads. Their eyes scanned the soldiers, searching, desperately, fearfully, for any sign of what would come next. Their breath trembled. Their hands tightened around each other. They waited, and the silence grew so intense it felt like the air itself might crack. For the first time since their capture, a sliver of uncertainty entered their despair. Not the uncertainty of terror, but the unfamiliar uncertainty of possibility. Something in the soldiers' expressions, something in the officer's posture, hinted that perhaps, just perhaps, the end they anticipated might not arrive in the form they feared. It was not hope, not yet, but it was no longer absolute doom. And that shift, small, nearly invisible, was enough to alter the course of everything that would follow. Enough to begin unraveling an order written miles away by someone who would never see their faces. The war had brought them all to this clearing, but conscience, unexpected, fragile, powerful, would determine what happened next. The officer held the paper for a long, unbearable moment, as though the thin sheet weighed more than every hardship he had endured since the war began. His fingers trembled, not from fear of the battlefield, but from the impossible choice laid upon him by men far from this jungle, far from these eyes staring back at him with terror and exhaustion. He could feel the soldiers behind him watching, their breaths shallow, their bodies tense, their moral resistance radiating through the humid air like invisible heat. And before him, the Japanese women stood motionless, their heads bowed, their shoulders sagging with resignation. The order hovered between all of them, a threat made of ink, but capable of extinguishing lives. He tightened his grip on the paper. No man in the clearing knew exactly what was happening inside the officer's mind, but they felt it, felt the battle between duty and humanity raging silently within him. His eyes drifted again to the women, forcing himself to meet the faces the order demanded he erase. One by one, their gazes flickered upward at him, faintly, timidly. He saw no malice, no challenge, only fear, hunger, and the quiet dignity of people who had endured too much to cry out anymore. These were not soldiers ready for combat. These were women who had marched across ruined landscapes, abandoning all hope long before their hands were bound. He could hear his own heartbeat now. A drop of sweat traced down his temple as the weight of the command settled deeper into his conscience. The paper shook slightly. He clenched his jaw. The silence became suffocating, too thick, too unnatural for a place normally alive with the constant hum of insects and distant artillery. Even the birds refused to break the moment, and then, finally, he exhaled. The sound was barely audible, but the soldiers behind him straightened, sensing the shift before they could even name it. Something inside him had changed, decisively, irrevocably. His shoulders, once rigid with the burden of command, eased just enough to signal that the war's expectations would no longer have absolute authority over him. Slowly, deliberately, he raised the paper in front of him. A murmur of confusion rippled through the ranks. Some of the soldiers tensed, thinking he meant to read the order again, to strip the moment of its fragile hesitation. But instead, he stared at the words as though reading them for the last time. His eyes narrowed, not with obedience, but with resolve. Then, in a gesture so simple yet so revolutionary in the context of war, he placed one hand firmly at the top corner, the other at the bottom. Time seemed to stretch, and with a sharp, unmistakable sound, he tore the paper cleanly in half. The soldiers flinched, not from fear, but from disbelief. The women gasped softly, their breaths caught in their throats. The tearing of paper echoed louder than any gunshot, louder than any command they had ever received. It cut through the jungle air like a declaration of rebellion, a refusal to bow to a cruelty that had already claimed too many. The officer held the two halves for a moment, letting them flutter slightly in the breeze, letting every pair of eyes in the clearing register what he had done. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. The act itself carried more meaning than any speech ever could. But when he finally addressed his men, his voice held a weight shaped by years of things he wished he could undo. "We will not carry out this order." The words were steady, unshaken. They sank into the soldiers' hearts with the force of truth. Every man felt something loosen inside him, something they had not even realized had been tightly bound until this instant. And though none dared to nod openly, their silence was filled with agreement. The jungle's stillness seemed to lift, as though the air itself approved. He stepped forward, closer to the women now. Their eyes widened, not with hope yet, but with uncertainty, a fear so deeply etched that even mercy felt dangerous. He lowered his voice when he spoke to them, sensing the fragility of the moment. "You will not be harmed." The Japanese women froze, their bodies rigid with disbelief. For hours, days, perhaps, they had prepared themselves for execution. They had whispered prayers, shared last glances, given up on seeing another sunrise. And now this man, standing in the mud with sweat on his brow and dust on his uniform, was telling them they would live. Some of the women blinked rapidly, unable to process what mercy felt like. Others trembled, the shock flooding their veins faster than they could steady themselves. A few dared to meet the officer's eyes, and he saw something raw and overwhelming reflected back at him. Gratitude, confusion, relief. The emotional collapse that follows when the body realizes death is no longer imminent. One woman whispered softly to herself, just a single word in Japanese that none of the soldiers understood. But the tone carried enough meaning, disbelieving wonder. The torn halves of the order slipped from the officer's fingers, falling like pale leaves onto the wet soil. They landed softly, merging with the earth, becoming part of the clearing that had witnessed their defiance. The soldiers watched as the flimsy pieces of paper soaked up moisture and began to wrinkle, a symbolic burial of an atrocity that would not be committed. The officer turned to his men. "We treat them as prisoners, nothing more, nothing less. The war has taken enough." The soldiers exchanged glances, not questioning him, not resisting. If anything, they seemed grateful for the decision that none of them had been brave enough to initiate. Their rifles remained pointed down, their shoulders relaxed for the first time since dawn. The moral burden they had been silently fighting lifted, leaving only stunned relief behind it. But the officer knew the risk he had taken. Disobeying orders was not something ignored lightly. Reports could reach higher command. Consequences could follow. Yet as he stood there, surrounded by women who now breathed with trembling disbelief, he felt no regret. Some sacrifices were worth making, not for glory, not for victory, but for the quiet knowledge that he had preserved something essential within himself. The Japanese women's postures shifted almost imperceptibly. Where moments earlier they had stood as condemned figures bracing for the inevitable, now their bodies softened. Their shoulders drooped not with defeat, but with release. Their knees wobbled, as though the sudden removal of fear left them unsteady. One of them covered her face with her hands as suppressed sobs broke free. The sound was faint, but heartbreaking, echoing through the clearing like a reminder of their humanity. A soldier closest to them instinctively stepped forward, not in aggression, but with concern. He didn't touch them, but his presence alone seemed to offer reassurance that the officer's decision was real. The women blinked up at him through tears, their expressions raw with disbelief. These were the same soldiers they had once been told would show no mercy. Yet here they stood, doing the unthinkable, choosing compassion. This moment would linger in their memories long after the war ended. The tearing of the paper, the officer's steadfast refusal, the soldiers' silent solidarity, the abrupt shift from death sentence to life restored. Kindness, given freely when least expected, carved itself deeper than any cruelty the war could inflict. The officer stepped back, surveying the clearing. His men stood quietly, respectfully. The women steadied themselves, breathing deeply as the realization of survival continued to settle into their trembling bodies. And just beyond the clearing, the jungle slowly began to stir, birds chirping, insects humming, leaves rustling, as if exhaling after a long period of holding still. The war would continue. The world would continue breaking in places far from this patch of earth. But for this small group of soldiers and the women before them, something irreversible had occurred. A boundary had been crossed, not of disobedience, but of conscience. A choice had been made that defied fear, protocol, and the relentless machinery of war. Kindness had been chosen over cruelty, humanity over command, life over death, and all of it began with the sound of tearing paper floating gently to the ground. After the order had been torn and the immediate fear had begun to dissipate, the soldiers acted carefully, deliberately, with a tenderness that seemed almost foreign against the backdrop of a war-torn world. Blankets were gathered from their own sparse supplies, some faded, some patched from prior skirmishes, and offered to the women who had spent weeks, perhaps months, shivering in damp, ill-fitting clothing. Water was distributed in canteens, the clear liquid glistening in the morning sun, and handed with unsteady hands, aware that even the smallest gesture could either calm or terrify. Food followed, simple rations that seemed paltry but carried immense significance, offered not as a formality, but as proof that mercy and compassion could exist even in the most unlikely places. The Japanese women hesitated at first, wary of trickery or cruelty, but hunger and human instinct overcame caution. They accepted the meager meals, their hands shaking, their eyes scanning the soldiers as if expecting violence at any moment, yet finding none. For many, this was the first time in weeks they had experienced something resembling safety. Their bodies, once taut with dread, began to relax incrementally. Small movements, a cautious sip of water, the careful wrapping of a blanket around trembling shoulders, became acts of quiet defiance against the years of fear and abuse they had endured. Some women sat on damp earth, pressing the blankets to their chests as if holding onto the warmth might somehow shield them from the horrors that had marked their past. Others leaned against each other for support, tears spilling quietly, acknowledging silently that life, fragile and precarious, still continued. The soldiers, in turn, moved with equal care, guiding the women toward shelter adjusting their positions so that the least exposed would remain protected, and keeping vigilant watch over the surrounding jungle, anticipating threats even in this rare moment of calm. The atmosphere was a strange paradox. A military camp, normally a place of strict rules and lethal authority, had become a haven for mercy, for fleeting humanity amidst the machinery of war. In the days that followed, the small routines established a fragile rhythm of trust. Each gesture of kindness, from a shared piece of bread to a carefully offered blanket, was amplified by the shock of its rarity. Conversations, halting at first due to language barriers and mutual apprehension, began to form. Soldiers learned to recognize fear, relief, and gratitude in ways that went beyond words. The women, in turn, discovered that the men who had once represented a looming threat were capable of empathy and respect, capable of sustaining life instead of extinguishing it. The camp transformed subtly, almost imperceptibly. Where once only the sharp bark of commands and the dull echo of boots on earth had existed, now laughter, hesitant and fragile, but unmistakable, began to emerge in quiet pockets. It was the sound of disbelief at mercy, the sound of life returning to those who had anticipated death. A woman tentatively smiled at a soldier who handed her a blanket, and the simple, human acknowledgement passed between them, a silent promise that they were, in this moment, safe. Some nights, lanterns were lit inside the modest shelters, casting soft, golden light across the faces of the women and soldiers alike. Shadows danced on the walls, revealing the contours of exhaustion, relief, and cautious hope. Mothers who had been separated from children, daughters who had been forced to grow up in terror, now experienced the rare luxury of warmth and comfort. The quiet intimacy of the shelter, the murmured words, the tentative laughter, the shared blankets, contrasted sharply with the chaos and violence that waited outside in the jungle, reminding everyone present that war, for all its destruction, could not fully extinguish human decency. Each act of kindness reinforced another, creating a network of trust and empathy that seemed to ripple outward, touching all who participated in it. Soldiers who had spent their lives trained to kill now found themselves teaching, guiding, and protecting. Women who had prepared for death now discovered the possibility of survival. Yet, even as relief spread through the camp, the weight of the world outside remained ever present. There were reminders of the broader conflict in distant artillery fire, in the worn uniforms of the soldiers, in the ever-watchful eyes of men conditioned to see danger at every turn. Despite this, the bonds formed in these days were resilient. The women learned to respond to kindness with small gestures of their own, offering smiles, helping with chores, or simply expressing gratitude through hesitant words and gentle nods. These acts became profound in their simplicity, signaling a restoration of dignity that had been stripped from them through months of captivity and fear. In this exchange, the soldiers too were transformed. Their understanding of their own humanity deepened by the realization that mercy could be enacted even in circumstances that demanded strict adherence to orders. By the end of the first week, the atmosphere in the camp had shifted dramatically, no longer dominated solely by fear and subjugation. The clearing became a place where life and survival coexisted with compassion. Every small action, whether distributing a blanket, sharing food, or simply offering a reassuring glance, carried immense weight. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the profound impact of empathy in the most unforgiving of environments. The women began to stand taller, walk more confidently, and even laugh softly at moments of shared humanity. The soldiers, having witnessed the immediate and powerful effects of their choices, carried themselves differently, aware that acts of kindness, even in war, were not signs of weakness, but of extraordinary moral courage. A delicate balance of trust had been established, a bridge built between two worlds that had been taught to hate one another, proving that even in a place designed for war, mercy could prevail. It was not a perfect world. There were still moments of fear, reminders of the violence that had shaped their lives, and the shadow of the broader conflict never fully receded. Yet within this small corner of the world, something rare and profound had been accomplished. Compassion had replaced cruelty, safety had replaced terror, and life, fragile yet indomitable, had taken root in the hearts of both captor and captive. And as they continued to move, interact, and survive together, the truth of that rare kindness became undeniable even at the edge of death. Humanity could endure, and mercy could flourish where it was least expected.